The city of Miami and its historically embedded racial disparities. Miami has always been a leader in diversity, with 70% of its population being Hispanic. When looking at how racial and ethnic influences have affected Miami, a controversial topic is that segregation isn't exclusive to Cubans or Latin Americans. It goes a lot deeper than that. The population of Miami is constructed of about 75% white origin alone, while about 18% is of Black or African American origin. The portion of this class that intrigued me the most is how historical public housing implementations based on discriminatory beliefs can still be seen today through modern real estate and neighborhoods that we're so familiar with. Let's look at the predominantly Black neighborhoods in Miami. Little Haiti, made up of about 73% Black inhabitants. Liberty City, about 82% Black inhabitants. And the most infamous Overtown, made up of about 68% Black inhabitants. Now let's take a look at the predominantly white neighborhoods. For example, here's Key Biscayne, its population being made up of about 0.02% Black inhabitants. Pinecrest, about 1.3% Black inhabitants. And the most infamous Fisher Island. This one was the most notable. Its population is made up of 0% Black inhabitants. These obvious differences arise in the question, why, despite the Fair Housing Act and the efforts in society that alleviate racial disparities, is there still such obvious differences? In order to support the idea that Miami's history plays a pivotal role in today's persistent public housing segregation, let's look at some class material. I refer to Euclid v. Ambler and Larson's Harmonious Inequality for Zoning. Euclid v. Ambler established zoning, which was used to regulate development by legislating what kind of properties can be built on certain lands. To get around this ruling, Miami City Commission designated most of residential quote-unquote colored town or overtown as industrial in the 1920s. This helped to restrict new residential construction and preserve the color line, allowing the city to assert racial segregation without explicitly codifying it into law. In Harmonious Equality, Orlando was used to show how managing and strategic implementations like zoning and public housing programs were issued to confront multiplying African American populations and establish racial residential segregation. Relating this to Miami, by the 1930s, much of Overtown was built up in traditional shotgun-style houses. But during the coming years before the interstate was even built, private developers and slumlords bought these dwellings and moved them to more remote parts of Miami. There, they were sold to farmers as housing for migrant agricultural laborers, and they were replaced with more profitable apartment houses. I refer to Jackson and Heathcott's readings to look into redlining. In 1934, the FHA continued to promote segregation efforts by declining to plan for compensation of mortgages in African American neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. Security maps rated neighborhood risk levels for mortgage lending on a scale from A to D, based on different factors like the neighborhood's access to amenities, zoning, housing stock, and most specifically, their racial makeup. St. Louis is used as a case study in these readings to examine how the city's future was influenced by redlining. Here's what they referred to as the red line map for a greater Miami in 1935. Agencies provided Miami's Black neighborhoods with a D rating, including Overtown, further restricting Black residents from home loans and adding to the institutionalization of racially based housing discrimination. This type of lending discrimination helped to maintain Miami's existing racial patterns and made the opportunity for home ownership inaccessible for many Blacks. These maps also helped to determine the future urban growth of many of Miami's neighborhoods. Finally, I wanted to relate Tuttle and White's readings to the history of Miami. These readings introduced the committee referred to as the Kenwood Hyde Park Property Owners Association in Chicago. White property owners and real estate agents began to arrange efforts and operations as migration picked up and the Black Belt began to become overpopulated in the late 1910s. They introduced their objective to, quote-unquote, make Hyde Park white and to avoid a Negro takeover and keep it clear of undesirables. I thought how the power of associations and committees were often irrepressible was quite interesting, specifically how their roles changed over time. So in the early 1900s, the Kenwood Hyde Park Property Association was used to instill racism in a public area. However, in 1950, the Committee Against Socialized Housing was established in Miami to fight new public housing developments and slum clearance initiatives. CASH, along with other lobbying groups, organized against the construction of any new public housing, slum clearance, or urban renewal initiatives.